It started with a deal that seemed too good to be true. Emily found the listing late one night, scrolling through her tablet while the dim glow from the kitchen spilled into the living room. She leaned over, nudging me with her elbow. "Dan, look at this," she said, her voice buzzing with excitement. I glanced over. The ad was simple: secluded country estate, affordable getaway. Peaceful. Private. Perfect. The photos showed an old manor tucked deep into the countryside, surrounded by tangled woods and overgrown fields. It had a certain charm, the kind of house with creaky floorboards, dusty corners, and a fireplace begging for crackling logs. The price? Suspiciously cheap. "That's weird," I muttered, rubbing the back of my neck. "What's the catch?" Emily rolled her eyes, dismissing my skepticism with a wave of her hand. "Maybe the owners just want someone there, you know? To keep it from falling apart. It's perfect, isolated, quiet, no neighbors for miles. The kids will love it." I didn't argue. She had that determined look in her eyes, the one she got when her mind was already made up. She sent an inquiry, and the response came fast. "We prefer quiet tenants. Respect the house, and it will respect you." I frowned. Something about it didn't sit right with me. Emily just laughed. "Old people and their weird phrasing. It's probably nothing." I should have trusted my gut. A week later, we packed up the car and left the city behind. Mia and Jack were asleep in the back seat, their heads bobbing gently with every bump in the road. The skyline faded, replaced by winding roads that snaked through dense forests. Eventually, the GPS gave up. The gravel path leading to Blackwood Manor was barely a road, more like a forgotten trail choked with weeds. The trees grew closer together, their bare branches clawing at the gray sky. And then, there it was, the house. It was bigger than I'd expected. 3 stories of weathered stone, its windows dark and hollow like watching eyes. Ivy crept up the walls, and the porch sagged under its own weight. A single dead tree stood near the front steps, its branches twisted and brittle. I killed the engine. The silence was immediate, thick as fog. No birds. No wind. Emily stepped out first, her breath visible in the crisp air. I followed her, and that's when I saw Morsley. I didn't expect them to meet us in person. They stood on the porch like they'd been waiting for us. Mr. Morsley was tall and thin, his sharp features carved with deep lines. Mrs. Morsley clutched a faded shawl, her eyes dark and hollow, her expression unreadable. No smiles. No warmth. "You're the Albrights," Mr. Morsley said flatly, his voice dry as paper. Emily forced a polite smile. "Yes, thank you so much for—" "The house likes quiet," Mrs. Morsley interrupted softly, her voice thin and brittle. She stared straight at Emily. "Don't go where you're not invited. Don't touch what isn't yours. Respect the house, and it will respect you." The words hung in the air like frost. Then Mr. Morsley stepped forward and pressed an old brass key into Emily's hand. It was cold. Heavier than it should have been. Without another word, they turned and walked away, disappearing down the path until the trees swallowed them whole. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Well, that wasn't creepy at all. Emily chuckled nervously, squeezing the key. The house groaned when we opened the door. But after that initial sound, everything felt surprisingly normal. The air inside was cool and stale, thick with dust. Faded wallpaper peeled like old skin, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, their edges fluttering slightly as we passed by. But there was nothing overtly wrong. Just the feel of a place that had been waiting too long to be lived in again. Mia and Jack rushed ahead, their laughter echoing through the halls. It was good to hear. It made the house feel less empty. By nightfall, we'd unpacked most of our things. Emily lit a fire in the old hearth, and soon the house was filled with the warm glow of flickering flames. The kids sat cross-legged on the rug, playing with their toys while Emily and I shared a bottle of wine. The creaks in the floorboards, the distant groan of settling wood, none of it felt sinister. Just the noises old houses make when they remember what it's like to have people inside them again. The first night passed without incident. And for the next few days, it stayed that way. The kids explored the woods out back, laughing and climbing over fallen logs. Emmy spent hours reading by the fire, wrapped in a blanket. I even found a dusty old workbench in the basement and started fixing up some of the loose shelves and creaky doors. It felt like exactly what we needed, a break from the chaos of city life. But beneath it all, the house was waiting. It had been almost a week since we arrived at Blackwood Manor. The days blended together in the kind of quiet that city life never allows. There was something liberating about the isolation, no traffic noise, no buzzing phones, just the rustle of wind through the trees and the occasional creak of old wood settling into itself. The house felt normal, comfortable, even, until the night everything changed. It started subtly. That day, the sky had been overcast, casting a dim, gray light that never quite brightened. Emily was curled up on the dusty old couch near the fire, a book resting in her lap. Mia and Jack had been outside, running through the woods. I decided to explore the house more thoroughly. Not just the rooms we'd been using, the guest rooms, the dusty library, the faded dining room, but the places we hadn't really touched yet. The basement. The door was tucked away in the back of the kitchen, almost hidden behind an old cabinet we moved to the side. The handle was rusted, stiff when I turned it. The door groaned as it opened, revealing narrow wooden stairs that descended into darkness. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating dust motes. The basement smelled of damp earth and something metallic, old iron, maybe. The walls were stone, rough and uneven, and the floor was dirt, packed down hard over the years. There wasn't much down there. Old furniture draped in mildewed sheets, rusted tools, and broken crates. But in the far corner, half buried under a tarp, I found something strange, a wooden door, smaller than the others in the house, set directly into the wall. It wasn't a storage closet. It didn't lead to anywhere. It was just a door. No handle. No keyhole. Just a door bolted shut with thick, rusted iron latches. I stared at it for a long time, the flashlight beam flickering slightly, though the batteries were fresh. The air felt heavier the closer I got. I didn't touch it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Emily was curled up beside me, breathing softly. The house was dark and silent, except for the faint crackle of the dying fire downstairs. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the stillness, when I heard it. A faint thud. Distant, muffled. Like something shifting deep beneath the house. I told myself it was the old foundation settling. That's what old houses do, right? But then came the second thud. Closer this time. I sat up, my heart ticking a little faster. I strained my ears, holding my breath. Silence. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe. Thud. Right below us. The basement. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Emily. Grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand, I crept down the stairs. When I got to the kitchen, the door to the basement was wide open. I stood there, frozen, flashlight trembling slightly in my grip. I knew I'd closed that door. I took a step closer, peering down the staircase. The dark swallowed the light from above, thick and absolute. I clicked on the flashlight and descended slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The basement was cold. I swept the flashlight beam across the space. Nothing had moved. Nothing seemed out of place, except the small door in the corner. The latches were undone. My mouth went dry. I know I didn't touch them. I hadn't even gone near that door earlier. But now, the bolts hung loose, rust flaking like old scabs onto the dirt floor. I approached slowly, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. I reached out, fingertips brushing the wood. It was ice cold, colder than the air around it. I listened. Nothing. I backed away, locked the door again, latching every bolt with trembling hands, and shut the basement door tight behind me. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Emily made coffee, the kids argued over cereal, and sunlight poured through the windows like none of it had happened. I told myself I was just tired, that maybe I'd forgotten to latch the basement door. But later that day, Mia came inside, her cheeks flushed from playing outside. She looked up at me and said, "Daddy, who's that man in the woods?" I froze. "What man?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She shrugged, like it was nothing. "The tall man. He was standing between the trees." He waved at me. My skin prickled with cold, the memory of the unlatched door burning at the edges of my mind. I went outside, heart pounding, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just shadows. The moment Mia mentioned the man, something shifted inside me, a subtle, gnawing fear that nestled deep, like a splinter under the skin. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, squinting against the harsh glare of the late afternoon sun. The woods stood silent, a brittle wall of trees just beyond the overgrown yard. The shadows between the trunks felt too dark, too dense for daylight. "Mia," I called over my shoulder, "where exactly did you see him?" She stood on the porch, clutching the railing with small, pink-knuckled fingers, her face half curious, half bored, the way kids get when adults start overreacting. "Over there," she said, pointing toward the tree line, her voice light, unconcerned. "By that bent tree." I followed her finger to a large oak, its trunk twisted unnaturally. There was nothing there now, no footprints, no signs of anyone passing through. It was just after midnight when I woke again. Not from a sound. From a feeling. You know that sensation when you're being watched? That cold awareness prickling at the back of your neck, even when you're alone? It was like that. Emily was asleep beside me, her breath slow and even. I slid out of bed quietly, careful not to wake her, and moved to the window. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the backyard. I scanned the trees, expecting, hoping, to see nothing. But then, I saw him. A figure. Tall, thin, standing motionless just beyond the edge of the woods. Too far to make out any details, but I could feel his gaze. He didn't move. Just watched. My chest tightened. I blinked. He was gone. The next morning, I told Emily. She laughed it off, brushing her hair back from her face. Maybe it was just a hunter. Or someone hiking. It's rural out here. People wander. But there was no casual wandering here. The nearest town was miles away, and the woods weren't exactly inviting. Later that day, Jack came running inside, his face flushed with excitement. "Daddy, there's a door in the woods," he said, tugging at my sleeve. I froze. "A door?" I echoed, kneeling to his level. "What do you mean?" He nodded, breathless. "Yeah, like standing there. Not on a house. Just a door." I felt that same splinter of fear dig deeper. I didn't want to take the kids, so after lunch, I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods alone. The air grew colder the deeper I went, shadows thickening even though the sun was still high. The trees felt too close, the branches arching overhead. It didn't take long to find it. Just as Jack said, a door. Freestanding. No walls. No frame. Just an old, wooden door propped upright among the trees, its surface scarred and weathered. My heart thudded in my chest. The strangest thing? It looked exactly like the small door in the basement. Same wood. Same iron hinges. I reached out, my fingers brushing the surface. It was warm. Against every instinct screaming in my head, I tried to open it. Locked. No handle. No keyhole. Just like the one in the basement. I couldn't shake the feeling that the woods weren't empty anymore. After everyone had gone to bed, I sat by the window, watching. Waiting. And then I saw him again. Closer this time. Standing just beyond the yard, half shrouded by the trees. His face was obscured by shadow, but I could feel him looking right at me. I gripped the flashlight in one hand and the fire poker in the other. My pulse hammered in my ears as I crept outside, every step heavy with dread. The cold hit me like a wall. I swept the flashlight beam across the trees. No one. But then, I heard faint scratching sound, coming from inside the house. I spun around. The light from our bedroom flickered briefly, then went dark. Emily. The kids. I ran. When I burst through the door, the house was silent. I sprinted upstairs, my heart a wild drumbeat in my chest. Emily was still asleep, undisturbed, her face peaceful. Mia and Jack, the same. But something was wrong. The air felt thicker. And again this weakest sound, coming from the floorboards. Like breathing. But it wasn't coming from us. The sound wasn't faint anymore. It grew louder with every heartbeat, a soft, rhythmic creaking, like wood under strain, but deeper, heavier. Not the house settling. Not the usual groans of old beams. It was deliberate. I got up, moving quietly, my footsteps muffled by the creaky floorboards I'd learned to avoid. Grabbing the flashlight from the nightstand, I made my way downstairs, the old staircase groaning softly under my weight. The house was dark, except for the faint glow of dying embers in the fireplace. Then I saw it. The basement door. Wide open. I stood there for a moment, trying to convince myself I'd forgotten to lock it. But I knew I hadn't. I slowly descended the narrow stairs, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The small door in the corner, the one with the rusted iron latches, was shut, but the floor in front of it was smeared with something dark. Blood. Fresh. My breath hitched. That's when I heard it, a faint creak from above. Someone was in the house. I bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. The lock clicked into place with a shaky hand, but it felt like locking the front door of a house already on fire. Emily, I hissed, racing down the hall to the bedroom. Wake up. She sat up, groggy and disoriented. Dan? What's wrong? Someone's in the house, I whispered, my voice tight with fear. She went pale instantly. I grabbed the fire poker from beside the hearth, my knuckles white around the handle. We crept into the hallway. The door to Mia and Jack's room was ajar. I pushed it open slowly. Empty. The beds were unmade, the blankets tangled. The window was wide open, the curtains fluttering. A smear of blood stained the windowsill. My heart stopped. Mia? Jack? I called out, my voice cracking. No answer. Emily clapped a hand over her mouth, stifling a sob. I rushed outside, barefoot on the cold grass, scanning the darkness with the flashlight. The woods loomed like an open mouth, shadows shifting between the trees. Then I saw him. A man. Standing at the edge of the tree line. Tall, thin, wearing dark clothes that blended with the night. His face was obscured by shadow, but he was holding something, small, limp. Mia. I didn't think. I just ran. Emily screamed behind me, her voice distant over the roar of blood in my ears. The man turned and disappeared into the trees, Mia dangling in his grip like a rag doll. I chased after him, branches clawing at my face and arms, roots trying to trip me. The flashlight bounced wildly, casting frantic shadows that made everything look alive. I followed the sound of snapping twigs, heavy breathing, mine and his. Then I found her. Mia was lying on the ground, motionless, her face pale, blood smeared across her forehead. I dropped to my knees, hands shaking as I checked her pulse. She was alive. Faint, but alive. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I turned just in time to see the man lunging. He tackled me, sending the flashlight skittering across the ground. We crashed into the dirt, his hands around my throat, fingers cold and strong. His face was inches from mine, twisted with rage, eyes wild and bloodshot. I fought back, adrenaline surging. My hands found a rock, heavy and jagged. I swung it, connecting with a sickening crack against the side of his head. He collapsed beside me, gasping, blood pouring from the wound. I didn't stop. I kept hitting him again and again, until the only sound was the ragged whiz of my own breath. I stumbled to Mia, scooping her into my arms, and ran. When I burst through the door of the house, Emily met me, tears streaming down her face. "We have to find Jack," she sobbed. And then we heard a scream. I pitched, terrified, coming from the basement. Jack's scream ripped through the house, sharp and jagged like glass shattering in the dark. Emily's face went pale, her eyes wide with panic. She sprinted toward the basement door before I could stop her, Mia still limp in my arms, her faint breaths hot against my chest. "Emily, wait!" I shouted, but it was too late. She threw open the basement door, disappearing into the darkness below. I had no choice. I set Mia down gently on the couch, grabbed the fire poker, slick with dried blood, and followed. The cold hit me instantly. It wasn't just the damp chill of an old basement. This was different, thick, suffocating, almost alive. The narrow beam of my flashlight barely pierced the blackness as I descended the creaking steps. "Emily!" I hissed, my voice swallowed by the oppressive dark. No answer. The only sound was my own heartbeat thundering in my ears and the faint, rhythmic dripping of water, or something thicker, hitting the stone floor below. When I reached the bottom, the flashlight flickered. I swung the beam across the basement, my breath freezing in the cold air. Blood smeared across the floor, streaked along the rough stone walls, glistening dark and wet. There were handprints, small ones, Jack's. Drag marks led deeper into the shadows, toward the small door I'd seen before. But the door was gone. In its place was a jagged opening, like something had torn through the wall from the inside. And from that black void came whispers. Low, overlapping voices, impossible to understand, but filled with rage, sorrow, hunger. I stepped closer, my flashlight trembling in my grip. "Emily?" My voice was barely a whisper. Suddenly, she stumbled out of the darkness, her hands and face streaked with blood, her eyes wide with terror. She crashed into me, gasping. "Dan, he's in there," she sobbed, clutching my arm. "He's alive." But she didn't finish, because something moved in the shadows behind her. A figure. Not the man from the woods. Someone else. Taller. Leaner. His face hidden in the dark, but his presence radiated something wrong. He stepped forward, the faint light revealing just enough, blood-soaked clothes, empty eyes, a smile carved too wide across his face. And in his hand, a knife. I lunged, swinging the fire poker with everything I had. It connected with a sickening crunch, but he barely flinched. His grin never faded. Emily screamed, pulling me back as the man slashed out with the knife, missing by inches. I shoved her toward the stairs. "Get Mia. Go." She hesitated, tears streaming down her face, but then she ran. I turned back just as the man charged. We collided, falling hard to the floor. The knife clattered out of his hand, sliding across the blood-slick stone. We grappled, fists flying, his hands cold and strong, fingers digging into my skin like claws. I reached for the poker, but he slammed my head against the ground. Stars exploded behind my eyes. He grabbed the knife. I reacted on instinct, grabbing his wrist, the blade inches from my throat. His face was inches from mine, those eyes, hollow and dead, but filled with something ancient and hungry. With one final surge of strength, I twisted, driving the fire poker through his chest. His mouth opened in a silent scream. Then he went still. I staggered to my feet, dizzy, blood dripping from a gash on my forehead. "Jack," I whispered, stumbling toward the dark opening. I stepped inside. The space beyond the wall wasn't just a hidden room. It was something else, a tunnel, carved deep into the earth, lined with old stones slick with moisture and streaked with blood. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of voices layered over one another. And at the far end of the tunnel, Jack. Huddled in the dirt, his small body trembling, his face streaked with tears. But he wasn't alone. Kneeling beside him was the man from the woods. His face was clearer now, gaunt, hollow-cheeked, with eyes that burned with something between hatred and hunger. He smiled when he saw me.
"You shouldn't have come here,"
he whispered, his voice like dry leaves scraping against stone. "This house, it doesn't let go." I didn't wait. I charged, rage and fear blinding me. The man lunged, but I was faster this time. I slammed the fire poker into his head with a sickening crunch again and again until his body crumpled to the ground. Blood pooled around him, dark and thick. I scooped Jack into my arms. His body was ice cold, but he was alive. I ran. Emily met me at the top of the stairs, Mia in her arms, both of them crying. We didn't speak. We didn't look back. We just ran. Out of the house, into the freezing night, the front door slamming shut behind us with a sound that felt like the house itself was laughing. We piled into the car. I turned the key. Nothing. The engine was dead. Then, from the darkness around us, footsteps. Dozens of them. Coming from the woods. Soft at first, like leaves rustling under cautious steps. Then faster, running. Figures emerged from the tree lean. Dozens of them. Their shapes flickered in and out of the moonlight, men, women, all of them thin and angular, like shadows carved from bone and sinew. Their faces were obscured, some masked with crude pieces of cloth, others painted with streaks of what I knew wasn't mud. It was blood. And they were running straight toward us. Emily screamed. I threw the car into neutral and twisted the key again, harder this time, my entire body shaking with panic. The engine roared to life. Relief surged through me like an electric shock. I slammed my foot on the gas, the tires spinning in the gravel as the car lurched forward, jerking violently down the overgrown driveway. But they were fast. Too fast. I glanced in the rearview mirror. They were gaining on us, their faces wild, eyes reflecting the moonlight. Some of them carried weapons, axes, rusted knives, lengths of jagged metal. One of them leapt onto the car. The roof buckled with a metallic thud. The windshield cracked as fists pounded against it, spiderweb fractures blooming across the glass. I swerved, trying to shake them off, the car fishtailing wildly. Emily was screaming. The kids were screaming. I was screaming. Another figure appeared in front of the car, standing dead center in the path, a tall man with a blood-streaked face, arms spread wide. I didn't hesitate. I hit the gas. The car struck him with a sickening crunch, his body slamming onto the hood, rolling up over the windshield before disappearing behind us. But more kept coming. Hands clawed at the doors, fingers smearing bloody streaks across the glass. One of the rear windows shattered, shards of glass raining down as an arm reached inside, grabbing at Mia's leg. Emily reacted without thinking. She grabbed the tire iron from the floor and slammed it down on the arm with brutal force. There was a wet crack, a scream, and the hand disappeared. I kept driving, the car bouncing violently over rocks and roots, headlights flickering as we barreled down the winding road. Then, a tree. Huge, ancient, and fallen across the path, its roots torn from the earth like twisted veins. There was no time to stop. I swerved hard. The car skidded off the road, crashing into a ditch. The impact was explosive. Glass shattered. Metal crumpled. The world flipped upside down in a blur of noise and pain. Then, silence. I came to, my ears ringing, the metallic taste of blood in my mouth. The car was on its side. The windshield was gone, replaced by a jagged maw of broken glass. Emily. Mia. Jack. I forced myself to move, every muscle screaming in protest. Emily was slumped against the door, her forehead bleeding, but she was conscious, her eyes wide with terror. The kids were crying, alive, but terrified. And then we heard them again. The footsteps. Getting closer. I kicked at the shattered windshield, crawling through the jagged opening, dragging Emily and the kids out one by one. My head throbbed, my vision swimming with dark spots. We couldn't run. Not far. Not fast. So we did the only thing we could. We went back to the house. The front door slammed shut behind us, the sound echoing through the hollow corridors. Emily collapsed against the wall, cradling Mia, whispering to her in broken sobs. I locked the door, though it felt like locking a screen door in a hurricane. They were out there, circling. I could hear them, whispers, footsteps, the faint scraping of knives against wood. Then, bang. Something slammed against the door, hard enough to rattle it in its frame. Another bang. And another. They were trying to get in. I grabbed the fire poker again, my hands slick with sweat and blood. My mind raced. We couldn't hold them off. There were too many. Then I remembered the basement. Not to hide. To finish it. Whatever was beneath this house, whatever had drawn them here, it needed to end. I turned to Emily, my voice hoarse. Take the kids upstairs. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone. Not even me. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. Dan. Just do it. I kissed her, kissed the kids, and turned toward the basement door. The banging at the front of the house grew louder, more frantic. But it didn't matter anymore, because I was going to face whatever was down there. And I wasn't coming back up until it was over. The house groaned like it was alive, its wooden frame trembling under the pounding fists outside. The air was thick, suffocating, filled with the distant sound of glass shattering and Emily's desperate screams upstairs. But I didn't stop. I gripped the blood-streaked fire poker tighter, every muscle in my body screaming as I descended the creaking steps into the basement. I had to end this. Whatever this was. The basement was colder than ever before, not the natural chill of stone and dirt, but something deeper. A sickness in the air. The jagged hole in the wall yawned open like a wound, the darkness inside somehow darker than the absence of light should allow. It felt alive. I stepped through. The tunnel stretched unnaturally far, carved deep into the earth, lined with crumbling stones slick with moisture and streaked with dark stains I didn't want to identify. My flashlight flickered as if struggling against something it couldn't fight. Then I reached it. A vast, underground chamber. Candles burned in pools of melted wax, their flames flickering wildly though there was no breeze. Symbols were carved into the walls, ancient, wrong, pulsing faintly with a sickly red glow. And in the center of the room, an altar. It wasn't like the ones I'd seen before. This was made of bone and stone, slick with fresh blood. Chains hung from the ceiling, rusted and stained, swaying gently even though the air was still. Standing beside the altar was the man from the woods. But he wasn't just a man. Not anymore. His skin was stretched too thin, his eyes dark pits burning with something beyond human rage. His mouth twisted into a grin that was too wide, too sharp. You brought them back, he rasped, his voice layered with others, as if 1,000 whispers were speaking through him. The house remembers. I raised the fire poker, rage burning hotter than fear. Where's my family? He tilted his head, his grin widening. They belong here now. Just like you. I charged, screaming, swinging the poker with everything I had left. It connected with a sickening crack, but he barely flinched. He grabbed me, his grip cold and inhumanly strong. I fought. I fought harder than I ever had in my life. But it wasn't enough. He slammed me to the ground, knocking the breath from my lungs. His face hovered inches from mine, his breath rancid, his eyes burning. These house feeds, he whispered. It always has. The truth unraveled in flashes. Not in words. Not in stories. In visions. I saw the house as it was before, built on blood and sacrifice, a place where people were dragged, screaming, to feed something that lived beneath. A cult, ancient and forgotten, worshipping a god not of light, but of hunger. The hunger. The people outside, the ones who attacked us, they were their servants. Generations of families tied to the house, bound to it. Caretakers of the rot. They didn't kill for pleasure. They killed because the house demanded it. It was a cycle. Families like mine were lured here, always at the right time, always when the house was hungry. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, I was alone. The chamber was empty. The candles burned low, flickering in the suffocating dark. I crawled back through the tunnel, dragging my broken body up the basement stairs. The house was silent now. No screams. No whispers. Emily was gone. Mia was gone. Jack was gone. All that remained were faint bloodstains on the floor, the only proof they ever existed. I don't know how I escaped. I stumbled through the front door, into the cold morning light, expecting to be dragged back inside. But nothing came. The house didn't stop me. It didn't need to. Because the worst part wasn't dying there. It was surviving. It's been 6 months. I'm writing this from a motel room, my hands shaking, my mind frayed at the edges. I can't sleep. I don't eat much anymore. The house never left me. I see it in my dreams. I hear the whispers in the walls. I feel its pulse beneath the floors of every room I step into. I left the house, but it never let me go. I don't know why it spared me. Maybe because it knew that what it took from me was worse than death. Maybe I'm the sacrifice. I've thought about going back. Ending it. Burning it down. But I know it won't matter. You can't kill something that was never alive. The house is still there. Waiting. And someone, someday, will find that same listing. That same affordable getaway. And the house will feed again.